morning, Howard.
Good morning, Aaron. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, sir. Very well indeed. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. The sun
Good.
is shining, so that's always a good start to the day, isn't it?
Is the sun shining as much as it would be in Australia?
No, probably not.
Because
But anyway.
we're about to get 45 minutes of that beautiful accent of yours, aren't we? Which I'm excited for.
Oh, thank you for that.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for joining us on Leadership Unplugged. I'll give a bit of context for those who aren't aware of the show. So Leadership Unplugged is generally conversations with people who are experts in their field, usually leader type people, might be COO, CTO, CEO, usually with a leaning towards a particular background. I know you, Howard, come from an operational perspective on things, which is what I'm excited to dive into today. But the general idea is that we go in largely unscripted. We might have an idea of some of the conversations we want to touch on, but we're just going to allow the conversation to flow. Does that sound good?
That sounds fantastic.
Excellent. I'm excited. Again, thanks for coming on. So let's start for the viewers and listeners with a bit about yourself, Howard. What's your story? How did you get to where you are now?
Well, yeah, thanks very much, and it's very good to be here. So, as you alluded to, I come from Australia. So I grew up just outside of Adelaide. I've had a great journey so far. It's been very interesting. I've been lucky enough to work in many places all over the world. This is my third time in the UK. A couple of times in Japan, some time in Hong Kong, Singapore, a little bit of time in New York, and of course a little bit of time in Australia as well. I started off in banking. I went through and did risk in banking and finance, and then also as a COO. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, I had a look at the world, and like a lot of people, thought, well, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening, and I would like to be part of that. I felt I'd sort of got to the end of my banking journey. And so I went and had a look at the tech sector, and ended up being the COO at Zoopla, their data solutions business. And I've been working for the last few years in a more consulting way in looking at operational excellence and the operational side of bringing companies, whether they're startups or established companies, together and looking at how they are doing things and helping them to work on either a digital transformation or an operational transformation on a digital basis to drive their operational excellence forward as much as possible.
Amazing. And you're currently a specialist advisor at the London Stock Exchange, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I'm helping them. Obviously, there's a lot of regulation that exists, and the stock exchange being an unusual financial institution. I'm in there at the moment as an advisor or a specialist implementer for the UK SOX program. So.
Amazing. As you know, I come from a financial trading background, so I'll try to avoid taking the conversation down this route, or we'll spend the entire 45 minutes there. So you mentioned your tagline there, and I think this is why when you and I first spoke, I was very interested in you. I think I look at things from a tech perspective based on the nature of what I do and recruiting tech staff. But you coming at it from the operational perspective and that tagline, operational excellence, which sounds brilliant, but what the hell does that mean?
Well, and I think it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's so many buzzwords and those sort of things out of there. And, when we started talking, it was because whilst you're looking at it from the tech perspective, I'm looking at it from the operational perspective. And operational excellence at its core, if you like, is trying to get a company to move in a single direction, hopefully customer focused, but helping everybody within a company to understand what the goals or missions and visions are within a company, and understanding how their day-to-day then relates to that. And when it works well, you have an organization that understands entirely where they're going and what they're doing and how their part of it needs to work on a day-to-day basis. And the opposite, of course, is what we get in a lot of organizations, where people are siloed within their own day-to-day, not necessarily understanding why their KPIs or their goals or what they're supposed to achieve has any impact on the company, and those sorts of things. And obviously, the more you can move away from that, and the more you can move away to a single purpose, the more focused the company can be. And then you can start to introduce lean concepts or Kaizen concepts, and understand that your priorities are the company priorities, and you're playing a part in that to help the company succeed, and obviously go along on your own career journey as well, and working towards those goals.
Amazing. So it sounds very logical, doesn't it? I remember when you first explained this to me on a separate conversation. It would seem that most organizations with a decent head on their shoulders would think, well, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. We want everybody pulling in the right direction and moving forward with a singular purpose. So why doesn't that happen, do you think?
I think that's an interesting question, and you're right. I mean, when you outline it in simple terms like that, it is all companies should be working like this, but not all companies are. And I think the reason generally is because there isn't a clear understanding or clear transparency about what the goals of the company are. And because people's day-to-day becomes very involved and very busy, I think that a lot of the time senior management don't spend the time to introduce the transparency that's needed to help the rest of the company understand the where, what, whys of their company mission or their quarterly goals, yearly goals, etc. And it does take a little bit of effort. You do need to sit down, work out, and go through effectively a tree diagram of if this, then that, if this, then that type of examples, so that you can understand that the tech part of the company needs to be involved with the finance part of the company, which needs to, obviously link into sales and link into HR, and you need to sort of go through each of the areas and understand, well, if we're going to achieve this, what does it mean for this area? And what does that mean for the individuals? And how are we going to do that? And then you can start to set your goals and your measurements of productivity or measurements of achievement, whatever you want to call them. I always try and move away from KPIs. I find KPI makes people a little bit nervous because it sounds like it's an extremely digital measure. But once you look into those, operational values or operational key results, then you can start to bring that together. It's not necessarily a difficult process, but it is time consuming.
And do you find that this is something that you're usually putting in retrospect, like they've messed up to this point and you're having to fix that? Or is it that you're trying to get ahead of that? If we're looking at some of the sort of tech startups and scale-ups that you alluded to, that you can kind of get ahead of that curve and put it in place? I
think that my experience, it tends to fall about 50-50. And that's just because of where I get brought in and when people understand the need for it. So if you're running a small startup and looking at the way to scale, which is the most important part about all of operational excellence, is that it helps you scale, then it's a relatively straightforward process to bring in, because it then becomes part of the core foundation of the company. When I come in and the company's already set up and perhaps has moved away from those values or from those ideas, or is new to those ideas, then it is more complicated. But the reason that I get brought in, or the reason that people come to me, is because they recognize the value in this idea and they want to get there. And so that's it's one of those things where you're pushing against an open door, I guess is the best way to describe it, because people want to have an organization or want to work for a company that they feel that they're all working together. That's part of the whole community feel of a company. And depending on the size, then understanding how your area relates to other areas and how you can take pride in the achievements that come with that, it is a fantastic thing. And so, sorry, going into a bit of a long-winded answer there, but it depends where the company is on their journey and what they're trying to do. But I'm almost always brought in when the company is looking to expand, when the company is looking to scale. And that may be from 1 to 10 people up to 50 to 100 people, or from 400 to 1,000 people.
Okay. And then, so playing devil's advocate a little here, If you didn't bring in someone like yourself or think about this operational excellence, and also bearing in mind that these organizations might not understand what the particular challenge is. Or actually, I'll ask you that question. Do you come in and go, let me analyze what's going on here and figure out what your problem is? Or do they say, I know that we are just completely misaligned. Everybody in the company is all over the place. I've got people working remotely and distributed, and nobody's singing off the same hymn sheet. I need to bring this together. I need to bring in some operational excellence. Or is it, I want to scale and I don't really know how, and you step in and help and guide? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you put it quite well, because they're the exact two things that I always see. So some of it is we are trying to scale and we don't know what we're supposed to be doing, because, and scaling is relatively straightforward. How do we increase the company? And whether that's scaling the amount of people and what they do, and it's trying to work out where you allocate the resources, because we would all like to have blank PE checks, and obviously the world has changed a little bit, and so having the unlimited resources to hire as many people as you possibly can in a short given time is not something that's often open to companies. People have to worry about their costs, and they want to make their hires as beneficial as possible. Of course, I mean, it goes without saying that you don't want to have to go through a rehiring process for a position time and time again. So having some clarity on what resources you need for the moment, what resources you're going to need in the near to medium term future, and what that looks like for your long-term goals is I struggle to say, but it's of supreme importance. The amount of time that people spend in the hiring process, in my experience, is directly related to how efficient the company is going to be. If you know the role that you're filling, the skills that you need, and you know why that position is important to be filled, then it's a far easier job than saying, we've got too much work to do, we just need more people.
That resonates, because I think a lot of what we try to do, and I'm going to try to avoid plugging ERG here, but I think we're big believers in planning before you decide to kick a ball, and having a proper, from a hiring perspective, having a proper data-driven hiring plan in place where you understand what your likelihood of hire is, how long it's going to take you, what you need and why, helps you infinitely moving forward. And you will save so much time and money from not doing it incorrectly.
Yes.
And therefore being able to do it smoothly and with a clear plan, which is easier to execute against. So I guess what you're saying, and that's why it kind of resonates, because you're just saying that across every function of the business, right?
Yeah, look, exactly. And, one of the interesting things about it when you're looking at the hiring process and trying to be ahead of the process, and what you were talking about there, is that if you can align your sales and finance and tech and HR functions in the right way, then you can be ahead of your hiring process. You can work out where you're going to need to be in 6 months' time, in 3 months' time. When we get to this point of our company scale, we're going to need this person or this type of skill sets. So why don't we have a chat to yourself or to whoever we need to talk to say, okay, in 3 months' time, we're going to need this many bodies, and this is the skill sets we're looking for, because we know that that's where we're going to be as a company then. And then you can start to plan things out. And when you can start to plan things out, then you can deal with the day-to-day business functions and unexpected issues in a far better way, because you know that this is going to be handled in a way that is along the plan. And if you're along the plan, you know where you're going. And if you know where you're going, it's far less scary.
That would be a wonderful world, wouldn't it, Howard? Can you imagine? If only. And there are organizations that do think that way, isn't there? And it makes everything around it easier and infinitely more scalable and manageable, and realistic and tangible. So you alluded earlier to the world changing a little bit.
Yes.
What we've got a finance expert on the podcast right now who now looks at things from an operational perspective, and I'm sure you probably did in your finance days. But talk to us a little bit about sort of what happened earlier in the year, your opinions on things like Silicon Valley Bank, banking in general, what's happening in finance, and what you think that means for companies moving forward.
It's interesting, and because in the same way as sort of operational excellence work, and we're talking within a company, you can look at the economy and understand that issues here create issues there, and the various impacts, and then they result in things that we see in the headlines. So, after the pandemic, where we had an unexpected increase in business, everybody expected everything to drop off, and it really didn't. Everybody got on with their lives and got on with work as much as they possibly could, and we were able to keep interest rates low, and inflation was low, and then there was always going to be a price to pay at some point because of the way that the government spent in order to keep the machine ticking along. Somebody is going to have to pay for that at the end, and there was going to be issues with the supply chain at some point because it was inevitable. We were going to have to feel that effect at some point. And so we started to get inflation, and the inflation means that, okay, well, we need to slow the economies down because we don't want 10% inflation on our food prices, and we don't want people's cost of living to be squeezed. And so need to slow the economy down, so let's raise interest rates. And as they raise interest rates, then a lot of companies that had been working on let's say, a tight line between their borrowing and their spending, suddenly that equation changes and their borrowing becomes more expensive. So as borrowing becomes more expensive, people have a far better or a far increased look at where their finances are, what's happening to their bottom line, how that's going to work, how they can plan for the next period that they're looking at. And we look at, say, maybe a year. And then the financial institutions have to be able to manage their risk in the best possible way. And risk is an interesting thing. I worked in risk for many years and I'm looking at controls. And risk is a bit like trust. It doesn't take facts to destroy trust. It just takes suspicion. The suspicion of lack of trust actually becomes endemic. And once that happens, then you have a situation where it becomes very hard to win back the trust of your customers. And so, in Silicon Valley Bank is a perfect example. We had what amounts to a traditional run on a bank, but it became the second largest banking failure in US history, or whatever it's been called now in the headlines, because their business model was to lend or to be the banker for Silicon Valley, hence their name. But there was a very concentrated group of people, and those people talk. And Silicon Valley had to make some decisions around the way that they funded themselves and the way that they managed their risk. And the market decided that a couple of decisions weren't what they were expecting. And because of that, the trust started to fade. And once the trust started to fade, particularly because a lot of their customers were VC or PE type businesses who were backing smaller businesses, then that economy or that ecosystem or group of people started to talk to each other. And the run starts to happen. And then once the run happens, or once the run kicks off, everybody wants to avoid being the last person holding the can. And so everybody moved. And so suddenly they had this incredible outflow of deposits and customers to safe havens. So, the JP Morgans, the HSBCs, the people perceived to be much safer, reap the benefits of it. Unfortunately, to the absolute detriment of Silicon Valley Bank. And it's now no longer a going concern because of that.
The dimension there of perceived to be safer is exactly the point, isn't it? That I think there are so many self-fulfilling prophecies within finance and economics, because so much of it is driven by human behavior in terms of supply and demand, especially, and things like elasticity of price, etc. But if people believe, and it sounds like this is what you're saying, if people believe that something's going to happen, they almost self-fulfill it to happen.
Yeah, look, very much in this sort of case, because it comes down to confidence in the institution. If you're running a small to medium tech company, you need to be able to pay your people, pay your suppliers, be able to do that. And you don't have the necessary buffers that a large organization will have to be able to make up that shortfall in case there was an issue. Now, at the core of that is your financial institution, the person that you rely on to move the money around and to make sure that all happens. And if you believe that they're not going to be able to fulfill that part of the journey, or you're going to, even worse, you're going to lose some of the reserves that you have for the money going in because it's going to be absorbed by a default, then it makes perfect sense to move your money where that's not going to happen. Yeah, as quickly as possible. And if people in the market are telling you, look, we're a little bit worried about this, then you look into it and you become a little bit worried about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think then, because we've seen it in the markets that we operate in, but we work with a lot of tech startups and scale-ups, and we've certainly seen for the first quarter of 2023 a shrinking desire for VCs and private equity firms to put as much money into organizations as willingly. It feels like everything was driven previously by growth at all costs, and now it feels like these VCs and private equity firms and all the other financial instruments that will invest money are looking at more profitability at all costs, and the kind of dialogue has changed slightly. Do you think that was coming anyway and inevitable, or do you think Silicon Valley Bank was a catalyst to that, or was it the starting point of that?
I think that's a really interesting question. History will tell us that at some point the economy will contract, and at some point it will expand. And because of that, there is an inevitability about it. We can, have a strong interest in economics, and there's often conversations within the economic papers about whether or not we're moving to a new paradigm and what the new technology means for the economic cycles and those sorts of things. History is very instructive. Things will expand, things will contract, and things can expand to a point where it no longer is viable. And if you are a VC and you're looking at a company, and we're looking at some of the valuations on these tech startups or established tech companies, and you're looking at the valuation and thinking, actually, now that it costs money to borrow, which it didn't before because interest rates had go up, does this valuation still make sense? And what is that cost of financing going to mean for that company? And that starts to change. And so you start to look at not necessarily, well, it doesn't, we're more worried about the future potential of the company, and therefore we're prepared to accept this valuation. You then start to have to look a little bit closer at the company's finances and say, okay, well, now that some of the equations have changed in terms of interest rates going up and the economy shrinking and people having less disposable income, what does that mean for this company? What is their actual path to revenue? How are they going to be? Are they being run as a good company? What does that mean? Are they going to be the first faller at the first hurdle type of idea when the economy starts to contract? And then and anybody who invests in a company is expecting a return. They're not investing out of the goodness of their hearts. and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of very conscientious investors out there, and I'm certainly not painting everybody with the same brush, but they are expecting a return on their investment. And they want their investment to give the return. And so they need to understand how that company is working, what are the underlyings, and where that company is going to be in the downturn. So the equation changes, and yes, it is inevitable this will happen.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it is a little bit complicated.
And I guess in a nutshell, if it's a tighter market, it's less likely that that organization is going to be successful, or less likely that that organization is going to make as much money as what was initially anticipated. If you've just looked at it from an outside perspective without going into detail, therefore investing your money in it is more risky than it was previously. But I guess on your note earlier, the monetary policy of increasing interest rates has worked there, hasn't it? Because by increasing interest rates, the cost of lending that money has increased, and
Yep.
therefore they're less likely to lend the money. Therefore, the organizations are less likely to produce as much as they want. Therefore, the demand for their goods is likely to fall, and inflation should, in theory, come down from that. So do you think that's been working then? Do you think that's working towards a point of reducing inflation if that's the main driver for the government right now?
Yes, it will work. It will take a little bit more time than everybody would like. But yes, I mean, we're seeing the economy slowing down at the moment, and wage inflation is decreasing. And unfortunately, in the UK, food inflation is not, but there are different issues underpinning that. But we're seeing across Europe and across the US that actually the raising of interest rates has worked pretty well.
And from everything we were talking about then around Silicon Valley Bank and financing and confidence in finance, etc., where do you see this moving then over the next 12 months? What do you think the ripple effects of that are?
Well, there is a consolidation that's happening, but the governments have moved pretty strongly to ensure that the faith in the banking system and the finance system has been restored or maintained at least. And so we're not going to get a repeat of 2008 where there was a large series of sort of fire sales. We've seen a couple of small or a couple of medium-sized ones, I guess, with Credit Suisse as well. That's a bit harsh on Credit Suisse. That's a very large institution. So, but I know a couple of my friends who worked at Credit Suisse would be upset if I called them medium. So I don't mean any disrespect. But I think that we will see a more traditional economic, I don't want to use the term recession, but probably recession for a short period of time, because they've managed to stop the fire. They've managed to contain it in such a way that, valuations of fintechs are being questioned at the moment. I was reading the papers yesterday, and they're sort of looking at Revolut's valuation has been downgraded or been reduced, and that will happen. But that doesn't necessarily mean the viability of those institutions is in question. There will be some consolidation, particularly on the tech side of the fintech side, because those institutions don't have as much runway, as much bandwidth as perhaps the larger institutions do. But there is a large amount of positives to be taken within that, because through that consolidation, you then start as a consumer to look at the various offerings, and institutions will be able to vary their offerings in better ways through these acquisitions, and you'll be able to get the melding of minds, of cultures, of institutions or of companies that were running relatively well, and now as a slightly larger or as a larger organisation, they can run in a better way and have a better offering to the public.
Do you think this will change anything fundamentally in terms of how some of these tech organizations operate and think about what they do? Like, I'm trying to bring that back to some of your operational excellence and whether you think the underlying core of what you do is the same.
Yeah, look, I think it does. I think that when things become tighter, you need to understand where your money is being spent, and is it going towards the ultimate goals for your missions and your goals. And you need to ensure that what you're doing as an organization is in line with what you're expecting and what you're planning to do. And it's about trimming off some of the fats or some of the dead woods, and not necessarily in potentially the people that you're hiring, but also looking at your operational processes and understanding where your value for the market is, and trying to work out how you then align towards that. So there's perhaps going to be less experimentation with the products that are taken to market because there isn't as much bandwidth to be able to do that in the tighter markets. But it does mean that companies will become leaner, fitter, and stronger because of it, if they take the opportunity to look at all of their processes and ensure that they're all aligned.
From a leadership perspective, if we're moving into a world where there's still opportunity, it sounds like what you're saying is that it's not going to, we're not about to enter hell. We might go through a slightly tough period, but it's not as bad. We've isolated the fire, as you said. I think that's a really good way of putting it. What characteristics do you believe leadership will need to show over the next 12 months to get through this and be profitable and keep the staff happy and move forward?
There are a lot of questions in what you just asked. And I think that's interesting. I think, look, overarchingly, as a leader, you need to be transparent. Look, this is what is happening within the company. This is what is happening within our market. This is what it means for us. And you need to be a leader. This is what we think it means. This is how we're interpreting it. Being transparent with the people that you're working with. They're employees, but you're working with them, and you need them to be able to feel secure or at least understand as much as they possibly can about what the situation of the company is. That transparency enables you to then have open discussions and honest discussions about what it means. Where's your company going? What is it doing? What are its customers doing? The next part about transparency is discussing it with your customers. What are you looking for? Has things changed? What's happened on your side? And having those open and transparent conversations as much as you can. And it's a fool's game if you think that nothing's changed on the customer side as well.
Right.
Yeah. And getting that feedback, and whether it's from your sales team or whether you have separate teams that are designed to particularly to pick up that information, and acting on that feedback and trying to ensure that your goals are still in line with your customers' goals for what they want from you. And that is not always an easy process. It is a time-consuming process. It is sometimes, it does feel a little bit like opening the kimono and saying, look, this is where we are. What are we going to do next? How is it going to work? And that transparency should breed comfort within the organization. And then you can start working on, okay, well, what does it mean for us operation? What does it mean for finance? What does it mean for tech? What does it mean for HR? What does it mean for sales? Where do we need to put our resources to make sure that our goals are still being met in a tougher time?
And how do you do that mechanically? If we're talking about communication, which is such a key thing in so many organizations, isn't it? And there's two things there: communicating your message internally and being transparent, and then an ability to be able to speak to your customers and communicate with them transparently as to whether things have changed and how you as an organization might be able to be agile around that and operate effectively. But if we were looking at the internal part of that, how easy is that? Like, it sounds good to say, like, be transparent with your staff, but what do you stand in front of 200 employees and say, yeah, we're about to hit a really tough time. Our customers don't actually really want the product that we're selling anymore, so we're going to have to adapt. But I'll keep you in the loop. It sounds, and obviously, well,
But it's not far off that, Aaron, because if we take the ideal situation, then all of the companies should know what the plan is for the next 6 to 12 months. You should have an idea of where you're going, where you expect it to be. And so now, if that changes, this is where we expect it to be, and this is where we are. Now, that can relate to sales, that can relate to scale, HR, or whatever that may be within the company. But the key point is that it relates to everything. And then you need to go through, this is what it means for this area, this is what it means for this area, this is what it means for this area. This is how we now need to realign our plans for the next time period, whether that's 3 or 6 or 12 months or whatever it is. The expectation or the reality is not necessarily going to meet the expectation as it was set a year ago. Things have changed. What has changed? Well, we're not going to hit these targets, or this is not going to happen in the way that we thought it's going to be. So what does that mean? And you, in the same way that you set up operational excellence, you do the transparency and the communication through the same lines.
Right.
Your overall vision and mission won't have changed, but the timeframes of when you're going to get there might. And so your planning then has to take that into account. And sometimes there are difficult conversations around transparency. We expected to be at this point in 3 months' time. We're not going to get there. Indeed, we've gone back 6 months on where we expected to be at this point in our journey. That means that those roles that we've hired in the last 6 months are potentially not required anymore. What does that mean? And how do you go through that process? And there is no way to get around some of those difficult conversations. But if you're transparent and open about those conversations, then at least you can start from that point where people aren't feel that they're being tricked or that things blindside people. And that creates a lack of trust within the company. And in the same way that a lack of trust or a suspicion of a lack of trust can start to destroy trust, as it does in the wider economy and banking, as we were talking about before, that can be insidious within a company as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a lot of these things feed into one another. So if an organization were to concentrate on operational excellence, by the very nature of that, they have to have transparent communication between every separate part of the business. And the more you do that, then as you move to potentially more difficult conversations or more positive conversations, it's less of a surprise because you've already started an open and transparent dialogue. So those open and transparent dialogues become easier as you move forward through time, effectively.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the key benefits of operational excellence because, well, and we're talking about it like it's just a single idea. Obviously, it's a multifaceted process, but it does allow you to deal with the ups and downs of the business cycle in a way that creates transparency, or it fosters and maintains transparency, and allows everybody to understand where they are within the company and what that means for the company's goals. Yeah,
absolutely. Sounds very good. I'm checking the time. I think we've probably got about 5 to 10 minutes left. So what I'd love to ask you, Howard, I'm going to switch the dialogue slightly here.
Of course, yeah.
And this might lean into some of the more separate conversations that you and I have had. But you're a well-traveled man. You've worked all over the world. You've lived all over the world, and I think that's incredible. You're a leader, and have been a leader, and operate across that area of leadership. We talked a lot today about the mechanics and the operational perspectives and tech and a very business-focused look at some of these things. How important, in your opinion, is the emotional aspects of some of these areas that we've discussed, i.e. something as simple as wanting to get out of bed in the morning and being happy?
You can't run a company if nobody wants to get out of bed and come to work. Let's be perfectly honest about it. I mean, it's something that I have learned over time, I think. And one of the key reasons I wanted to leave banking, for example, and move into what I deem as the more interesting world, certainly for me, is I want to work for companies where I feel that I'm fully engaged and fully involved in what's going on. And I understand the whole thing. Now, I worked for very large tier one organizations that had, north of 200,000 people. So expecting that type of environment from those organizations is unrealistic. But the emotional parts of feeling that you are working towards something that fits in with your cultural values or fits in with the way that you see your career going cannot be underestimated as a huge motivating factor. And if you're working for an organization where people tell you what's going on, they explain to you what the plan is, you understand your role in that, you understand what it means for your career, and you understand why your colleagues are doing what they're doing as well, then you are involved in the company and you feel, I don't want to say emotionally attached, but you should have a positive feeling about what you do each day. And if you have the positive feeling about what you do each day because you know where you're working towards and what that means for you, then you're going to be a more engaged and hopefully more fulfilled employee. And that's a great feeling. I mean, we'd all love that feeling. Let's, isn't that what we're all kind of looking for? This is why we choose the jobs we do and that sort of thing. And if you can get to that state, and if you've got leaders that understand that and are trying to foster that within you, then that's fantastic. That gets me out of bed.
Mm. Do you think that dialogue has started to open up more? Like 20, 30 years ago, nobody would really talk about mental health within the workplace, for example, and thinking about people's happiness and people's well-being. I think things like COVID have probably played a part in that. I think it's probably shifted people's perception of what work means and whether we're all just part of a machine that's been built from the Industrial Revolution that we still operate in now, and question some of that and thinking, do we need to work these hours? Do we need to work 5 days a week, etc.? Do you think that's a positive thing? Are you more old school with that thinking? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Very, very positive. And I think that's it can only be better for people. I think that so I have a lot of conversations about this with colleagues and friends who are sort of similar levels of experience and seniority and that sort of stuff. And there's a sharp divide in the camps of people where people are very much, people need to be in the office 5 days a week and I need to understand what they're doing. And then there's the other side of things where people, well, they just need to do what I'm asking them to do and I don't really mind how they do it. And I think that management theory and how to manage people takes time to understand. And when we have a paradigm shift like the pandemic, where suddenly everything was changed, we're still trying to work out, and people are still trying to adapt as leaders as to how that's going to work going forward. Now, my personal view is that I think that hybrid working is a good idea. I think it's more, you shouldn't be blind to some of the challenges in it, like creating team culture, like creating company culture. It is more difficult if people are looking at things through a screen. But it does mean that if you put the work in to ensure that people understand what it is they're supposed to be doing and you let them get on with it and they achieve those goals, then if they're a happier person within their own lives because they're able to spend more time with their families or on the golf course or whatever pursuit it is they want to do, then that can only be positive as well.
I had a similar conversation with a client recently that said that the results had gone down when they allowed people to work remotely, their outputs, etc. And my question to this particular person was, is that your fault, not theirs? Like, have you built an infrastructure that allows you to manage effectively and allows your people to execute effectively whilst operating in a remote environment? Like, it might not just be that your staff have just gone home and are sitting in bed reading a book and not doing any work, which is you could tell that's instantly where his mind was going. And I wasn't saying it's not that. Maybe it is that, but maybe there's an element of you were never really particularly open to it anyway. And because of that, you haven't built an infrastructure that allows your people to be successful. Does that make sense?
And I think that's entirely it. And I think that the one thing I'd add to that comment is that there isn't a one size that fits all. Within, not necessarily, let alone an industry, but within an individual company and within the individual roles. I've worked with sales teams and you see them in the office once or twice a week. And that's great because it means that they're not having to be in the office and they're out meeting clients or they're talking to people and that sort of stuff. And that has always been the case. That's effectively hybrid working. It's working in a remote place. It's just not working from home.
Yeah.
But if an operational person that relies on the team to function as a whole, and you're part of a chain that passes information on, then there is going to be some benefit of sitting in the same room at the same time at times. And it's working out how you manage that and what that means. And you have to spend the time to understand not only the results that you're expecting, but the people's individual circumstances. And that takes time and effort.
Absolutely. And I think I have a slight bias towards this from a hiring perspective, but do you believe that there's an element where organizations moving forward have to think about this? Because if they don't, and we continually move towards this world, then you won't be able to hire anybody moving forward in 24 months' time when everybody else has adopted that and is doing that effectively.
Yeah, you have to break it down to its core. Why would you offer hybrid working or complete remote working? The reason that you're doing it is because you want to spread your net as wide as possible to hire the best people. And if you're hiring the best people, if that's actually what you want to do, then you need to work out what it takes to get the best people. And are the best people locally available? I'm in central London, so it's never necessarily been that big an issue because people will travel to London. But the pandemic has meant that they're less likely to live in the big cities now, or people are less likely to want to stay in the big cities. So what does that mean? I've got friends who live out in the countryside, deep, dark countryside as far as I'm concerned, who have an hour and a half, 2 hours of commute. Now, does it make sense for that person to come into the office 5 days a week? It probably doesn't. They could probably spend that 3 to 4 hours commuting, working, and fulfilling their other personal goals and be a better employee. You should think about that when you're hiring.
I think it's funny because it alludes to pretty much everything we've talked about today, doesn't it? Where before you decide to action it, you zoom out a little bit and just look at it from a very logical perspective. What am I trying to achieve here? Yeah. Put a bit of a plan around that and then execute against that. It kind of leans into everything we've talked about with operations, what I was talking about with hiring, just taking the time up front to assess exactly what it is you're trying to do and then how you're going to achieve that goal.
Yeah, look, exactly. And I think that when you're looking at the hiring process particularly, I think that's really important. I mean, if you're not doing that, if you're not taking those logical steps, then you're going to create friction within the process, and that friction is always going to cause you problems.
Love it. Final question, Howard. What makes you happy?
I'm going to be a bit controversial. I don't like the term happiness that much.
Okay.
I like fulfillment. I think happiness, if I immediately think of happiness, a lovely, a warm fire and a glass of scotch and some cool music playing, talking to my friends is a great, happy place to be. But fulfillment is about aligning my work and private life or social life together and ensuring that I'm getting what I need out of every day. So that's not a great question, actually. I want to retract that great answer. I want to retract that a little bit. I think it's about, I'm a curious person, and if I continue to learn and continue to, feel that I'm moving forward, then that makes me happy.
Love that. It's a great answer. It's a pleasure having you on, Howard. Thank you for all of your analysis on everything. I'm sure we'll probably do this again because there'll be more topics that pop out this year. I have a slight feeling.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciated it. I hope I didn't ramble on too much. I do have a tendency, but thanks very much. This has been great, and I'd love to come back on. There's so much to discuss in this world, and it's always nice to speak to someone who understands.
Yeah, absolutely. Same. Well, it's been a pleasure. This podcast, for everybody listening and for viewers who won't know, we've got all of our podcasts on Apple iPlay and Spotify and on our YouTube channel. I'm not going to say like and subscribe. You do whatever you want to do. If you want to listen to more interesting conversations like this one with other leaders in space from different perspectives, then reach out to me or connect with me in whatever way you can. There's more content available. But Howard, thank you very much. I will catch up with you shortly, my friend. It's a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Have a great day.
Take care.
Goodbye.